Despite what it looks like, the American ruling class is not really divided. There are no right and left factions that seek to destroy each other by various legal and not so legal means. The staged left versus right conflict is meant for the regular population only, to keep them fighting among each other and to create the illusion for the taxpayers that they are being represented, that they have a powerful lobby. The most successful empire for the longest time was the British one. It was ruled by a cluster of dynasties that was way bigger than people realized. They managed to do what other empires failed to do, create a large roster of people to perform certain tasks, without infighting, without falling apart. In a regular empire, you had a king and his sons would battle for the crown, or the king would be poisoned by his brother or cousin. Just too much backstabbing. Eventually, a regular dynasty would become decadent, lazy, self-indulgent, and crazy, and then the military would stage a coup or a bunch of senators. But the British maintained discipline for centuries. Those dynasties go back more than 1,000 years even. They ran smaller kingdoms and principalities before they even took over Britain. They always had enough people to replace someone, to select the best one suited for a specific job, and enough people to run a vast family intelligence network domestically and internationally. It's their secret sauce. They pick the right people, and they know the intelligence business, the power game. It's time we learn from the winners, not the losers. Not even the arch-enemies of the Brits, the French, could compete in that sense. The French royal family didn't seize the opportunity to modernize the empire with science and secretly controlled liberalization. Some powerful French circles feared to be left behind on the international stage, and that's why the chaotic French Revolution happened, and afterwards they had to experiment wildly with republics and dictatorships. The British Empire ran like clockwork. Through the Royal Society, they controlled the best science, and through intelligence, they ran the new big corporations, the new merchant banks, the new central bank, the politicians, and the churches. The Americans may have won the War of Independence, but they lost the intelligence war against Britain. The American colonies were heavily saturated with British agents. And the result was that France had to sell its vast territories to the new United States for cheap. The United States expanded and they were a republic on paper. Yet the elites copied the British system of cultivating a ruling class. These people in higher circles had to like each other, marry each other, be involved in intelligence activities. There had to be discipline. They gave each other the best spots in government and business. Some observers had feared a fiasco in the 1800 elections. They didn't think a democratic change of government would actually happen. They expected a breakdown and war. Instead, it worked like a charm. The only time there was a real rift was when Southern families tried to maintain an old-type system with slaves on plantations and not move forward to a modern system. It was the Democratic Party which became dominant in the South after the Civil War, ironically. In the early 1800s, someone from the Roosevelt clan published his concept for an American socialism. This was way before Karl Marx and these other weirdo Europeans. It's nothing else than overtaxation and overregulation. It doesn't matter if you call it socialism or something else. It was supposed to be a control system for workers in the emerging industrial age. They didn't quite know how this was going to play out, and they wanted to maintain these kind of options. Controlled capitalism, however, worked better for the United States empire, though, and it took many decades for the Democratic Party to adopt socialist ideas. Mega corporations dominated different industries, and this made it necessary to have a controlled political choice for those workers. Powerful families like the DuPonts at the early 20th century figured that reducing work hours and increasing pay for those workers created the modern consumer who then bought more goods like cars. So the car manufacturers profited, the banks who gave the loans, the tire companies, the gasoline companies, etc. But this model became too successful for the average person. Workers more and more afforded houses, several cars, 4 to 5 kids, college education for the kids. At some point, these average families would get too smart, form dynasties, and figure out the intelligence game and the power game. Therefore, the brakes were put on the wages and opportunities for the regular citizens. Schools became worse and silly socialist ideas were offered to the people, government handouts, and so forth. Ultimately, the Republicans played the role of Christian conservatives pro-business circles, and the Democrats became social democrats. Depending on how you grew up and what information you were exposed to, you picked one or the other group and voted that way. Databases became a thing. Then the first punch card calculation machines, and then computers. The Simulmatics Corporation bragged around the year 1960 that they could predict and influence elections with their IBM computers and the code language Fortran. Over time, this turned into psychometrics. You could build a psychological profile of every citizen and run simulations on supercomputers. How will people, or how will a certain group of people act if the economy gets worse? If there are less opportunities, wages get worse, and so on. You can run simulations, tweak the settings until you like the results, and then try to implement this agenda in the real world. Isn't it astounding that Democrats and Republicans have about a 50-50 equilibrium? The chances of this being a coincidence are basically zero. It is carefully crafted social engineering. Elites can always put some money into a party or activism to boost or slow down one of the big ideological political groups. You can always split these groups even further. You can boost radical leftism versus regular leftism. You can fund African American pressure groups. You can use critical theory to widen the distrust between men and women in any groups. You can boost conventional conspiracy narratives, and you can boost right-wing extremism. Before and during World War II, there was an explosion in the research of psychological warfare. After the war, this research was expanded and split into different pieces and introduced to civilian universities. Camouflaged as opinion research, sociology, psychology, etc. These experts can design what is needed for activist movements to become literal cult movements. It works the same for the extreme woke movement, the Q movement, or anything else. They know what you fear and desire most. They can fine-tune propaganda down to the smallest target groups and even the individual. That's called micro-targeting. They get you to dress and talk in a weird way so that they only feel comfortable among their own peers. They can get you to stop critical thinking and go along with what the group believes. And more activism becomes virtual on the internet, so human interaction gets reduced and people become more and more separated from reality. Every major topic or crisis gets politicized. Gun legislation, abortion, the Ukraine war, anything. You can't win inside this two-party cartel and the socially engineered cult cluster of ideologies. You have to move past that, form good relationships, and use strategies that worked for those who are in power. Learn from the winners, not the losers. After the Cold War, the American two-party cartel actually got out of balance, right? So the Soviet Union was gone, and then you had the Gulf War. And after that, you saw the presidency of Bill Clinton. And if there hadn't been voter manipulation in the year 2000, you wouldn't have had President George W. Bush. Now, this was documented at the time by various people, for example, Greg Palast, and this was also covered a lot by conventional conspiracy media at the time. Nowadays, they have conveniently forgotten all of that. And then, in the year 2004, the same voter manipulation techniques happened. So many people were tossed from the voter lists and votes were not counted right. And this was also heavily documented at the time. So you saw 2 times a George W. Bush administration. The Democratic Party didn't really protest that voter manipulation. They created some kind of fuzz, and they demanded a recount here and there, but ultimately there was no big outrage. There were no arrests made. There was no big incident. It just happened. And then, of course, you saw the Obama era. And after that, again, the same manipulation techniques were used by the Republicans, again documented by Greg Palast, to get Donald Trump into office. And so this was all orchestrated and done because the system needs that frequent change in the White House and also majorities in Senate and the House and the Supreme Court, right? If you had let people vote, and if you counted those votes accurately, you would have seen only Democratic presidents ever since Bill Clinton. Now, that doesn't mean the Democrats are better. That doesn't mean that it should have been that way. It's just that the two-party cartel got seriously out of balance. And so that, therefore, the balance was reintroduced by illegal means. And the Democrats went along with that. And so you had this back and forth between administrations the way it's supposed to be. Now, there were several reasons for that imbalance. One was that older Christian conservative people were dying every year, and the newer generations were not that interested in these old systems and these old ideologies and what these people stood for. But at some point, the internet and especially conspiracy circles, that all became more powerful, and you saw a lot of frustrated young people, especially young men. And they were not interested in socialism. So normally, if you grow up poor, if you don't have a lot of opportunities, if your life is pretty bad, you are usually a target for socialist propaganda. But many younger people didn't want to turn into socialists. So that's why the Republican Party and Republican media such as Fox News, they started to cater to this younger conspiracy-minded audience. Remember during the Bush administration, you were not supposed to criticize the 9/11 Commission. You were not supposed to question anything. This was considered almost treason, unpatriotic. And during the Obama administration, and then of course the Trump administration, at some point, you basically couldn't distinguish Fox News anymore from, let's say, InfoWars. It sort of became very, very familiar. And classic conspiracy media was then pushing the Republican Party and Republican candidates. So look at all this media and look at all this activity on social media. Look at your Twitter feed. How much of this is engineered? How much of this is just supposed to divide people, divide the average taxpayers, and create and cultivate these different movements?